A cop saw a black woman driving and assumed she was up to no good. Suspicious activity, he claimed. But as he reached for his handcuffs, she calmly reached into her bag and pulled out the one thing that flipped his entire world upside down. Because this wasn't just any black woman. This was a US senator. And in that moment, he knew his career was over. The city glowed beneath them as Senator Naomi Graves stared down Officer Matt Rourke on the deserted rooftop parking garage. His hand hovered near his holster, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple despite the cool night air. "You really don't want to do this," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Her senatorial ID badge glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. Rourke's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you've stepped into, Senator." Behind them, the door to the stairwell burst open. Armed men in tactical gear emerged, weapons raised. Naomi didn't flinch. "Actually, I think I do." In that moment, as the laser sights danced across the concrete, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was war. Let me take you back to how it all began, to understand how a routine traffic stop turned into a deadly showdown with corruption at the highest levels. Senator Naomi Graves wasn't supposed to be driving herself that night. The Secret Service detail assigned to her had been called away on an emergency involving another high-profile politician. At 42, with her cropped natural hair and usually impeccable pantsuits, she had become one of the most recognizable faces in Washington since her election last year. That evening, she'd swapped her usual formal attire for dark jeans and a navy blazer, her Senate pin small but visible on the lapel. The late-night legislative session had dragged on for hours as they hammered out details of her police accountability bill, the one that had earned her admiration from civil rights groups and enemies in places where badges were worn. The dashboard clock read 11:37 p.m. as Naomi guided her black SUV through the quiet streets of D.C., mentally rehearsing tomorrow's committee speech. That's when the flashing lights erupted in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. A reaction ingrained since childhood. Picture this: a black woman alone at night, being pulled over. Senator or not, Naomi knew the drill. She'd been here before, many times before. She pulled over smoothly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. 10 and 2, just like her father had taught her decades ago. The officer approached, flashlight beam deliberately shining in her eyes. He was white, mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and shoulders that strained against his uniform. Officer Matt Rourke, though she wouldn't learn his name until later. "License and registration," he demanded, his hand hovering near his holster as if she represented some imminent threat. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Naomi kept her voice neutral, professional, the same tone she used in Senate hearings. The flashlight beam didn't waver from her eyes. "You were driving suspiciously." "Suspiciously how?" she asked, unable to keep a hint of edge from her voice. He didn't answer, instead studying her license with exaggerated care. "You're a long way from your district, Ms. Graves." "That's Senator Graves," she corrected him. "And I live here while Congress is in session." His expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." Naomi's heart quickened, but her face revealed nothing. "I don't believe that's necessary, officer. I've provided my identification and—" "I said, step out." His hand moved to his holster, not grabbing, but making sure she saw the movement. The air between them crackled with tension. Before Naomi could respond, her phone buzzed on the dashboard. A name flashed on the screen. Director Avery, U.S. Secret Service. Rourke's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but confirmation. And that's when she knew. This wasn't random. He'd been waiting for her. What Rourke didn't know was that Naomi Graves hadn't reached the Senate by accident. Before politics, She'd spent 15 years as a prosecutor specializing in police corruption cases. She'd faced down threats before. She'd stared into the eyes of people who wanted her silenced. She knew what she was seeing in Officer Rourke's eyes wasn't just the casual racism she'd dealt with her entire life. This was something targeted, something dangerous. "Officer Rourke," she said, noting the name on his badge. "I think we both know this isn't about my driving. Is this about the police accountability bill?" His expression flickered for just a millisecond. That was all she needed. Behind them, a second patrol car pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. Officer Elena Carter stepped out, Rourke's partner. Unlike him, she approached with her hands clearly visible, her body language non-threatening. "Senator Graves," she said quietly, "we need to talk, somewhere private." Naomi's mind raced. This night was about to get a lot more complicated than a routine traffic stop, and she was right. Because sometimes, the very people sworn to protect you are the ones you should fear the most. 30 minutes later, Naomi found herself in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn vinyl booths. Only 3 other patrons occupied the space: a truck driver nursing a coffee at the counter, and an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie. "I shouldn't be here," Naomi said, her fingers wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. "You realize I could have you both reported for harassment." Officer Carter glanced around the diner, then leaned forward. "Senator, I'm not who you think I am." Rourke sat stiffly beside his partner, eyes constantly scanning the entrance. His knee bounced nervously under the table. "I need you to understand something," Carter explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "That traffic stop wasn't random. You're being watched." The words hung in the air between them. "Because of my bill," Naomi stated rather than asked. Carter nodded slowly. "You're making powerful enemies, the kind that don't play by the rules." Rourke's jaw tightened. "You should back off. Some battles aren't worth fighting." Naomi studied him, noting the contrast between his threatening demeanor earlier and his current nervous energy. "And you, Officer Rourke, where do you stand in all this?" He looked away. "Just delivering a message." "A threat, you mean?" Naomi's voice was ice. Carter slid a napkin across the table. A phone number was scrawled in blue ink. "If you want to know more, call this number. Payphone only. No cell." "Very cloak and dagger," Naomi remarked, but tucked the napkin into her pocket nonetheless. Rourke suddenly stood. "We've said enough." He threw a few bills on the table and headed for the door without looking back. Carter lingered for a moment. "Be careful, Senator. These people, they've done this before." As the officers left, Naomi remained at the booth, mind racing. The warning had been delivered. The question now was whether it was genuine concern or part of the intimidation. "Stay with me, because this is where things start to get dangerous." The next morning, Naomi sat in her office on Capitol Hill, surrounded by the trappings of power that suddenly felt like a thin veneer. Her chief of staff, Marcus, stood by the window, expression grim. "You should have called me immediately," he said, running a hand over his close-cropped grey hair. At 60, Marcus had been with Naomi since her days as a prosecutor. He knew when she was holding something back. "I needed to think," she replied, sliding a folder across her desk. "What do we know about Officer Matthew Rourke?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." Inside the folder were printouts of police records she'd called in favors to obtain. Complaints filed against Rourke for excessive force. Racial profiling allegations, all dismissed or buried. 6 complaints in the last year alone, Naomi said. All from black drivers. All for suspicious activity stops. Sound familiar? Marcus nodded. And his partner? This Officer Carter. That's where it gets interesting. Naomi pulled up a file on her computer. Eleanor Carter, transferred from Chicago PD 2 years ago. Exemplary record. No complaints. Odd pairing, Marcus observed. Very. Naomi tapped her desk thoughtfully. I want to know who Rourke reports to. Find me the connection. Over the next 3 days, Naomi dug deeper while maintaining her public schedule. Committee meetings, constituent calls, press appearances, all while pieces of a disturbing puzzle began fitting together. The pattern was clear. Rourke wasn't acting alone. A network of officers across 3 districts showed similar patterns of harassment against minorities, all connected to a powerful police union that had publicly opposed Naomi's accountability bill. And at the center of it all? Chief Robert Sullivan, head of the union and personal friend to half the senators opposing her legislation. Naomi was scrolling through Sullivan's social media when she noticed a familiar face in the background of a fundraiser photo. Officer Rourke in civilian clothes, standing close to the chief. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Found the connection. Sullivan was Rourke's commanding officer 5 years ago. 3 excessive force complaints disappeared under his watch. The pieces were falling into place, but knowledge was dangerous, especially when those you were investigating had badges and guns. Have you ever felt the weight of eyes watching you, knowing that someone is tracking your every move? That's how Naomi felt as she left her office that evening. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she walked to her car. The security guard's nod seemed a beat too slow. The janitor she passed avoided eye contact. When she reached her vehicle, she found a parking ticket on the windshield, except it wasn't a ticket. Unfolding it revealed a photo of her house, her private residence back in her home state, and scrawled across it in red marker, "Some battles aren't worth fighting." Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she slipped the paper into her pocket. The message was clear. This wasn't just political anymore. This was personal. That night, alone in her DC apartment, Naomi poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon and considered her options. Back down and let the accountability bill die in committee. Years of work wasted. But her life would return to normal, or fight, and face whatever escalation came next. The bourbon burned her throat as she made her decision. She hadn't broken barriers her entire life just to back down now. She picked up her secure line and dialed Director Avery at the Secret Service. "I need to report a credible threat," she said when he answered. Then she called the number Carter had given her at the diner. A voice answered on the second ring. "I was wondering if you'd call." "I want a meeting," Naomi said firmly. "All parties involved. Tonight." "That's not how this works, Senator." "That's exactly how this works," Naomi countered, "because I've spent the last 3 days building a file, and if anything happens to me, that file goes public." Silence on the line. "1 hour," the voice finally said. "Rooftop parking garage at Marshall Plaza. Come alone." "I'm never alone," Naomi replied, and hung up. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The next move would be the most dangerous, forcing a confrontation with people who preferred to operate in shadows. She slipped her hand into her desk drawer, fingers wrapping around the small canister of pepper spray she'd carried since her days as a prosecutor. Tonight, she would either expose a corrupt system or become its next victim. And trust me, you won't believe what happens next in this deadly game of chess between a senator with everything to lose and cops who've forgotten their oath to protect and serve. The Marshall Plaza parking garage stood 12 stories tall, a concrete monolith against the night sky. At this hour, the rooftop level was deserted, a perfect location for a meeting no one wanted documented. Naomi's heels echoed across the concrete as she stepped out of the elevator. The city lights spread out before her like a carpet of jewels, but she kept her focus on the shadows between the sparse vehicles. They were already waiting. Rourke leaned against a concrete pillar, arms crossed. Carter stood a few feet away, her posture stiff. Between them, A third figure, an older man with silver hair and the confident stance of someone used to authority. Chief Robert Sullivan. "Senator Graves," Sullivan called out, his voice carrying across the empty rooftop. "Bold of you to come." Naomi approached steadily, keeping equal distance between herself and the three officers. "I'm not known for backing down, Chief Sullivan." Sullivan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's become painfully clear. You've caused quite a stir with this little crusade of yours." "Police accountability isn't a crusade," Naomi replied. "It's necessary reform." The wind whipped across the rooftop, carrying the distant sounds of the city below. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, a reminder of the world they were fighting over. Sullivan stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You have no idea what you're meddling with. 30 years I've served this city. 30 years watching politicians like you come and go with your reforms and your oversight committees. And 30 years of protecting officers like Rourke," Naomi countered, "who abuse their power against the very citizens they're sworn to protect." Rourke's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Your bill would tear apart the foundations of police work in this country," Sullivan continued. "Good cops unable to do their jobs for fear of lawsuits. Split-second decisions scrutinized by people who've never worn the badge." Naomi stood her ground. "Good cops have nothing to fear from accountability." Sullivan laughed, a harsh sound in the night air. "That's the problem with you politicians. You see everything in black and white." "Interesting choice of words," Naomi replied coldly. Carter shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the elevator. Something in her posture sent warning signals to Naomi. Something was wrong. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. 4 men stepped out. Dark clothing, no uniforms, but the bulges under their jackets told Naomi everything she needed to know. "What is this?" she demanded, heart pounding against her ribs. Sullivan's expression remained impassive. "Insurance, to make sure our conversation remains private." The men spread out, forming a loose semicircle around the group. "This has gone far enough," Carter suddenly said, stepping forward. Her voice had changed, harder, more authoritative. Sullivan turned. "Stay in your place, Carter. That's not my name." In one fluid motion, she pulled out her badge, but it wasn't a police badge. "Special Agent Rebecca Lewis, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Sullivan's face contorted with rage. "You're bluffing." 3-year undercover operation investigating corruption and civil rights violations within metropolitan police departments, she continued, her eyes never leaving Sullivan. "And you just walked into a federal trap, Chief." Rourke's hand moved toward his weapon, confusion evident on his face. "What the hell is happening?" "Ask your boss about Operation Blind Eye," Agent Lewis said. "Ask him about the slush funds, the targeted harassment campaigns against reform advocates." Sullivan's face had gone pale. "Shut your mouth." "Ask him about Councilman Jenkins," she pressed. "About the evidence that was planted, the witnesses who were pressured." Naomi watched the dynamic shifting, pieces falling into place. "You've been building a RICO case." Agent Lewis nodded. "And you, Senator, became our unexpected catalyst. Your bill got them nervous, made them sloppy." One of Sullivan's men stepped forward, hand reaching inside his jacket. "Boss, we need to shut this down now." The atmosphere shifted in an instant, tension crystallizing into imminent violence. "Stand down," Sullivan ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. The man didn't listen. Instead, he pulled out his weapon and aimed directly at Agent Lewis. The gunshot echoed across the rooftop like a thunderclap, but the bullet didn't come from Sullivan's man. It came from above. "Federal agents! Weapons down!" The night erupted into chaos. Dark figures rappelled down from a helicopter that had appeared silently overhead. Laser sights danced across the concrete. Sullivan's men ducked for cover, some returning fire. Naomi felt someone tackle her to the ground as bullets pinged off the concrete around them. Her cheek scraped against the rough surface as she was dragged behind a parked car. It was Rourke. "Stay down!" he yelled over the gunfire, his body shielding hers. Confusion flooded her mind. "Why are you—" "I'm dirty, but I'm not a murderer," he growled, checking over the hood of the car. "I never signed up for this." Through the chaos, Naomi spotted Sullivan sprinting for the stairwell door, two of his men covering his escape. "He's getting away!" she shouted. Agent Lewis appeared beside them, crouched low, her weapon drawn. Blood trickled from a graze on her forehead. "My team has the exits covered." Rourke's expression hardened. "Not all of them. There's a service elevator on the west side. Maintenance access only." Lewis cursed under her breath. "Cover me," she told Rourke, then glanced at Naomi. "Senator, stay here. Backup is 90 seconds out." But Naomi had spent her life fighting from inside the system. She knew this moment, this evidence, was everything. "The hell I will. If Sullivan escapes, this all falls apart." Rourke looked between them, then made his decision. He pulled out his backup piece, a small revolver from his ankle holster, and handed it to Naomi. "Remember which side you're on, Senator." Together, the three of them moved through the firefight, ducking between vehicles as federal agents exchanged gunfire with Sullivan's remaining men. The service door was halfway across the rooftop, exposed ground to cover with bullets flying. They would have one chance to make it. Naomi took a deep breath, remembering all those who had fought and died for justice before her. If this was her moment, so be it. "On three," Agent Lewis said, meeting Naomi's eyes. "1, 2. The door to the service elevator burst open. Sullivan emerged, a hostage in front of him, a young FBI agent, gun pressed to his temple. "Federal agents, stand down now," Sullivan shouted, desperation making his voice crack, "or I put a bullet in his head." The gunfire stuttered to a halt. All eyes turned to the standoff. In that moment, suspended between violence and justice, Naomi realized something profound. This was larger than her bill, larger than one corrupt chief. This was the breaking point between a system designed to protect power and one that served justice. And she was standing right at the center of the fracture. Time seemed to stand still on that rooftop. Sullivan's hand trembled as he pressed the gun harder against the young agent's head. Sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool night air. "It's over, Robert," Naomi called out, stepping forward despite Rourke's attempt to pull her back. "Look around you." Sullivan's eyes darted frantically across the rooftop, at the federal agents with weapons trained on him, at his own men being handcuffed, at the helicopter hovering overhead, spotlight blazing down. "This system protected you for 30 years, Naomi continued, taking another step forward. "But it ends tonight." Something broke in Sullivan's expression, the realization that his world was crumbling before his eyes. "You have no idea what it's like out there," he spat. "The decisions we have to make every day, the threats we face." "I know exactly what it's like," Naomi replied, her voice carrying across the rooftop. "To feel threatened, to be judged based on appearance, to have power wielded against you unfairly." Behind Sullivan, a shadow moved. Rourke, who had circled around during the distraction, a flash of movement, a grunt of pain. The hostage dropped to the ground as Rourke tackled Sullivan from behind. Both men went down hard, the guns skittering across the concrete. And just like that, it was over. Federal agents swarmed in, securing Sullivan as he lay face down, the fight gone out of him. Rourke stepped back, hands raised, accepting the handcuffs placed on his own wrists without resistance. His eyes met Naomi's across the rooftop. "Sometimes doing the right thing comes too late," he said as agents led him away. Agent Lewis approached, holstering her weapon. "Your security detail is having a collective heart attack downstairs, Senator. Apparently you disabled your tracking device." Naomi allowed herself a small smile. I needed to handle this myself. Lewis shook her head. Politicians always have to be in the room where it happens. If you've been paying attention, you might be wondering how this all plays out. How does justice unfold after such a dramatic confrontation? The weeks that followed brought a reckoning unlike anything the city had seen in decades. The evidence Agent Lewis had gathered during her 3 years undercover, combined with the files Naomi had compiled, painted a damning picture. 17 officers arrested, 3 precinct captains, the entire executive board of the police union. The press called it the Blue Wall Collapse. Naomi sat in the gallery during Sullivan's arraignment, watching as the once powerful chief was denied bail. The charges were extensive: racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations. But perhaps most surprising was Matt Rourke's decision. Faced with significant jail time, he made a choice that shocked everyone. He cooperated, fully and completely. Every operation, every cover-up, every officer involved. I need you to recognize this truth. Sometimes redemption begins with admission of guilt. Why did you do it? Naomi asked him during a deposition 3 weeks after the rooftop showdown. Why turn on Sullivan in the end? Rourke looked older somehow, the arrogance drained from his face. My daughter, he said simply. She's 15, mixed race. Her mother's black. Last month, she told me she's afraid of the police. His voice cracked. Afraid of people like me. The testimony he provided became the cornerstone of both the criminal cases and the renewed push for Naomi's police accountability bill. In committee rooms and on the Senate floor, skeptical colleagues who had opposed reform suddenly found themselves unable to ignore the evidence. The bill passed with modifications, but with its core intact: mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight boards, an end to qualified immunity for officers who violated civil rights, real consequences for those who abused their power. For her part, Agent Rebecca Lewis received the FBI Medal of Valor. The 3-year deep cover operation had exposed corruption beyond what anyone had imagined. The system doesn't change overnight, she told reporters after the ceremony. But when good people are willing to stand up, even at great personal risk, change becomes possible. And what about our senator who refused to be intimidated? If you're ever in Washington on a Thursday afternoon, you might spot Naomi Graves in a community center in Anacostia. Not making speeches or holding press conferences, but mentoring young activists, teaching them how to work within the system while never accepting its flaws. 1 year after that night on the rooftop, I visited her there. A dozen young faces surrounded her, eagerly absorbing every word. Senator, I asked as the session ended, after everything that happened, would you do it all again? She considered the question carefully. The night Sullivan pulled that gun, I wasn't thinking about legislation or my career. I was thinking about every person who's ever been pulled over for driving suspiciously, every parent who has to teach their children special rules for surviving police encounters. She looked around at the young activists gathering their things. This fight didn't begin with me and it won't end with me. But as long as I have a voice and a vote, I'll use them. As for Officer Rourke, his cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, 5 years instead of 20. He spends his time speaking to police academy cadets about the slippery slope from small compromises to corrupted values. The city's police force has begun the long process of rebuilding trust. Body cameras are standard now. Civilian complaints are taken seriously. It's not perfect. No system created by humans ever is. But it's progress. And sometimes progress is enough to keep hope alive. Remember this. If nothing else, justice doesn't come from silence. It comes from those brave enough to speak truth to power, even when, especially when, that truth is dangerous. Sometimes that truth comes from a U.S. senator being pulled over for suspicious activity. Sometimes it comes from an officer who finally chooses right over loyalty, And sometimes it comes from ordinary people who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way they must remain. The struggle continues, but so does the hope.